Breaking news, ladies. Registration is now open for the Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program, Class of 2023, and we start the first week of January. If you are a women's health professional with an existing practice and you've struggled to incorporate fertility awareness cycle charting into your client work, this is the program you've been waiting for. There's nothing like it offered anywhere. Transform your practice in 9 months. We start the first week of January 2023. Apply now at fertilityfriday.com/FAMM live. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLIVE. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 440. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with over 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormone health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I have been consistently outspoken about hormonal birth control over the past 2 decades and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I teach women's health professionals how to utilize the menstrual cycle as a vital sign in their practices, and I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of 2 beautiful boys and a brand new baby girl. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with me today. Today I'm sharing a brand new episode in my FAMM Practitioner series. I'm sharing my interview with Teal, and today's interview, I feel like we cover a lot of ground. We talk about her experiences with hormonal birth control and non-hormonal birth control, and her story really resonates with me in a number of ways because it's a very common experience to, at least that I've heard in my programs and all these years working with clients. There's many women who try, this birth control, and then they try that birth control, and then they try this birth control because, it just doesn't sit well with them. And these stories often end with a sense of frustration at some point where you're trying all these different birth control methods. It seems like we have so many choices. I would call it the illusion of choice because although we feel like we have so many different choices and there's so many different versions, most of the choices that we have are other versions of the same thing. So if we think about the pill, the patch, the ring, the hormonal IUD, there are different versions of hormonal methods. And many women have similar side effects when they're using those methods because essentially they're different iterations of the same thing. Although it can feel like we have a lot of choices from the outset, when you start trying different things, and if you're not satisfied with birth control and you end up having to switch from one to the other, it can come to light that we don't have as many options as we think. And so Teal's story, I feel like, is a really great example of that and really showing the challenges that many of us face trying to find the right birth control. And also showing how many women discover fertility awareness. It's often that kind of last resort. I've tried everything. I didn't really think this was going to work, but now I've learned more about it and it actually is an effective option. Teal's personal experience and challenges with hormonal birth control and other types of birth control have, I'm sure, informed her decision to incorporate fertility awareness into her practice. And so she also shares what her experience has been as a practitioner bringing this methodology into her professional work. So before we jump into today's episode, let me tell you a little bit about Teal. Teal has always been deeply interested in exploring the ways that communities can come together to build health and resilience. She believes that self-care is an essential practice and that by nourishing ourselves, we are better able to show up for others. As a clinical herbalist, her goal is to work in partnership with clients to envision what wellness looks like for each individual, finding creative and pleasurable ways to incorporate herbs, medicinal foods, and seasonal practices into everyday life. Teal is a trauma-informed practitioner who emphasizes herbal care for generative, reproductive wellness, mental health, and navigating stressful times. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into today's episode. And I'm really excited to be here today with Teal. Teal is a member of my current FAMM program. And as we're recording this, we're just edging towards the end of our, official year. So we've been together for many months now. And so without further ado, welcome to the show, Teal.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, Lisa. My name is Teal. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a clinical herbalist. And as Lisa said, have been a member of the FAMM program this year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like it's been a really good year. We have been meeting weekly, and we've just you and I have had so many opportunities just in calls and hot seats and all that good stuff. And so really looking forward to jumping into everything today. And I think a good place to start, as usual, is maybe you can share with us a little bit about your personal and professional story so you can kind of weave it in together, however makes sense. But maybe you can start with my favorite question, how old were you when you had your first period? And what was that journey like? If you've used contraceptives before, and what inspired you to use fertility awareness personally, and also what brought you to eventually want to bring it into your practice? So that's a mouthful, but I'll let you kind of navigate that however you like.
Sounds great. I was 12 years old, almost 13 years old when I first got my period. And I definitely knew that it was going to be coming. I'd had conversations with my mom and other people in my life about it, and had friends that were starting to get their periods. So I came home from school and kind of realized, oh, this is happening. And I knew what it was and instantly went to tell my mom. And she had a really sweet reaction. She started crying and getting emotional. And then, hooked me up with the pad, told me kind of how to do the whole thing. And then she started calling her friends and telling them. And it actually felt like a really sweet celebratory thing. One of her friends made me a beaded necklace with a goddess on it that was like my moon necklace that I could wear. In case it's not clear, I come from a hippie dippy family. So it felt like a really beautiful celebratory introduction in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. When you first said that your mom told her friends, initially I was like, is this going to be a good thing or a bad thing? Like a good thing because obviously it ended up being this wonderful celebratory event for you. But then I was like, what if it was like you didn't want her to share your business? And it was really interesting because actually when you said that, I was like, oh, was this good or bad? That sounds just like a wonderful experience, though. Having just keeping into consideration that I've been doing this type of interview for years now. And for anyone who's listened to many of the reality episodes, you'll hear my question, which is often the same, and so many different answers. So it's really nice to hear a positive experience because everybody doesn't have that. So maybe share with us then a little bit more about what happened afterwards. So what were your periods like? I mean, obviously it sounds like a very positive introduction into that, which is nice. So did that kind of carry over? Has your experience with your periods been positive? And have you used contraceptives before? And then kind of what led you to use fertility awareness?
Yeah, absolutely. So my periods were okay. They were painful in some capacity for as long as I can remember. I always experienced cramps and some PMS mood dysregulation. But again, since it was a really open thing that was talked about in my household, I felt like I could reach out and get support for that pretty easily. My mom started giving me herbs for my period when I was right after I started bleeding, so 12, 13-ish. Yeah, I'm trying to think back. Yeah, definitely had some PMS, but for the most part, I'm just like, okay, yeah, this is part of my life now. I did go on birth control for the first time when I was 14 years old. I started having sex pretty young and knew that I wanted to be responsible when I was doing that. And so I started on the birth control pill and had a pretty bad experience. I tried one and I don't remember what type it was, but it made me feel really sick. I would be nauseous and throwing up and didn't feel well. and tried probably 3 different types over the course of maybe a year, and would only try them for about a month or two and then realize, oh, this one doesn't work, and then take a break and try another one. But really, I never found one that really felt like it sat well with my body or felt right.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting because then before you went on it, you had cycles for a year and a half, maybe up to 2 years, depending on at what point of your 12th year you got your cycle. Do you think that played into it, because you had this awareness of what your normal cycle was like before you went on the pill?
I think so. I think also I feel really lucky in that I've always felt pretty in touch with my body and pretty able to be like, oh, this doesn't feel right. Like, I think because I did have that experience of knowing like what a baseline felt like, then I could say like, oh, like this isn't sitting well for some reason.
Mm-hmm. And then do you remember what those early cycles were like? Like, did you get a cycle pretty much every month? And although you had a bit of pain and PMS, like it was still pretty, like it, what's interesting is from doing these interviews, when I don't hear much about it, it usually means that it was actually just pretty typical. But I'm just curious if that was what your experience was like before you went on it, because you obviously went on it for birth control. You weren't going on it for some sort of cycle issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I told my parents it was for cramps, and they saw right through that. And they were actually really concerned. They sat me down and we had a conversation about, hey, this is an artificial hormone. And obviously it's your body and your choice, but we don't feel awesome about you starting to take artificial hormones at such a young age. And it's something you might be on for a good chunk of your life. And please just think about that. Which in hindsight, I'm like, oh, 13-year-old self, listen to your parents, or 14-year-old self. But of course, at 14, like, yeah, sure, whatever. And also I felt like that was the most responsible choice for me at the time as a contraceptive method. So, there are the ups and downs. But back to your question, before I went on birth control, I had normal cycles. They started up and then I had them every month from then. And I've been really lucky because I'm sure, as I'll get to in a minute, I've been on other forms of birth control in the past. And every time that I've stopped one, I've pretty much immediately gotten my cycle back. And it's been as I would expect it to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's so interesting. And again, I think one of the things that I often reflect on, because I've spoken to friends and colleagues of mine who are having this conversation with their daughters or their nieces, and in a similar kind of vein, they're wanting to tell them, okay, like these are the risks of this that you might not have heard about. And then, many times the daughter or niece will still go on contraceptives. And the way I look at it, though, is that it's still helpful to have that conversation, because you did have that in the back of your mind. Even though you made that choice, you still were given that heads up, where many women are not given that heads up, so to speak.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then, so you tried birth control, like it sounds like you were kind of swapping back and forth. So what happened? Because at some point, it sounds like you kind of realized that maybe the hormonal stuff wasn't working well with your body. So how did you manage that? Did you try different other forms of birth control as well, other than the pill?
Yeah, I did. So when I was 16 years old or 17, somewhere in there, I got on the Mirena IUD. And it worked really well for me at the time. Now, of course, that I know more, I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about that. And while I was on it, I didn't menstruate at all. I had a couple light periods, I think, right when I got it put in. I'm sure it won't shock anyone to hear that the insertion was horrific. I've had 2 IUDs and both of them were incredibly horrible experiences.
Well, for the sake of the podcast, do you want to walk us through it? I don't know if it's getting old for listeners who've heard many of these experiences, but at the end of the day, this is something, as I've said on the podcast, so I personally was terrified of the thought of putting something in there because I was afraid of pain, but I didn't know how consistent this experience was. So maybe just take us through that briefly and then, continue.
Right. So I think the biggest thing, like we were talking about with having the conversation about the potential risks of the pill and then getting to make that choice, I think that informed consent is incredibly important when you're making any choice with your body. And I don't I did not have an understanding when I went to get that first IUD inserted what the experience would be like, and particularly how painful it would be. And really, I think at that time just didn't actually have a sense much about just how kind of intense it is to have like a foreign object in your body for an extended amount of time. Like, I think that at that point, no one really sat me down and had the conversation about what it meant. I just knew that it was an extremely effective form of birth control, which is what I was looking for at the time.
Mm-hmm. Well, and standard questions, did the doctor offer you any pain relief? And did they give you any instruction as to what time of the cycle to come in? And then if you were to just describe the experience, the insertion, pain level on a scale of, 0 to 10, 10 being like someone's driving a nail into your hand or something, how would you describe all that?
Right. The experience felt I've had mixed experiences with care at Planned Parenthoods over the years. I think it really varies by your provider and location and all the things. And this was not a particularly great experience. The practitioners were nice, but there just wasn't a lot of explaining like, oh, now I'm going to do this, and this is what you might feel, and this is what you might experience. It was very like, sit down, and didn't really have a lot of information beforehand. I think I might have been told to take an ibuprofen, but I don't actually remember. And then the process happened, and it was extremely painful. I mean, I would put it on like the 9 scale. It was really up there. Yeah. Yep.
So interesting. I mean, I'm not going to let this derail our whole conversation today, but you can tell that I'm really concerned about this IUD insertion pain thing. And as a provider, they must know because they're doing it. So they must see the reactions of these women who are getting this IUD inserted. And so I question a lot of things, like, well, why are they not telling you? I think I'd be curious actually to talk to a provider. I've never who inserts them. I don't think I've ever talked to a provider. I've never asked. So maybe I have talked to someone who has inserted them, but I don't know.
Right.
So now I'm curious about that. But my general understanding or thought is that they think, well, yeah, it hurts, but it's only for a short time. It's just like pulling a Band-Aid off. So we just need to do it and move on with our lives. I feel like that might be how they're looking at it, or the weird concept of the cervix doesn't have nerve endings. But your experience would highlight the importance of actually having that conversation. From all these conversations, I would say that if you're thinking about getting an IUD, definitely ask for pain medication and consider. I know a lot of women are told to come when they're on their period because the cervix might be a little bit more open. I would suggest potentially considering around ovulation if you're cycling naturally. Right. Because if you've ever touched your cervix, not everyone is comfortable with that, but if you ever have, it is actually a lot softer and more open during that time for the most part. I know everyone's experience is a bit different. So public service announcement over. So you had the IUD inserted and you started with the Mirena. So maybe take us through that. And you said that you had another one, you had 2 in your life. So even though with the pain, you did go back a second time. So I'm also curious if there was a different experience there or.
Right, absolutely. So I had the Mirena for 2 years. I did not menstruate during that time. And I actually had the Mirena reject itself. I knew that you should periodically check the strings. And so about 2 years later, when I was 19 years old, or I guess a few more years later, I was 19, I went to check the strings and felt hard plastic coming out of my cervix. And being the type of person that I am, I decided that I could probably get it out myself. And I won't go into the details on that, but ended up in the ER and had an extremely dismissive older doctor just tell me that I should have pulled harder after sitting in the ER in pain for about 5 hours and bleeding. So that was a really negative experience. Yeah, that wasn't great. And when I tell the story, I'm kind of surprised that I actually went back to get another IUD after that. But around that time period after the Mirena rejected and was taken out is the first time that I heard about fertility awareness. And I had some friends in college that were using it. And it's funny because I actually went out and bought a CBT thermometer and I started taking my temperature and kind of doing some research and dabbling a little, and made the really intentional choice that I didn't feel responsible enough at that time to use the method and have it be an effective form of birth control.
That's really interesting. So, I mean, first I'll just comment on the pulling,
Right.
so first of all, you're not the only one to, like, I'm sure, I'm sure I've heard stories. I'm sure sometimes it works out, but but yeah. So it sounds like just overly negative experience. These are the things I think about the IUDs though, so with the IUD, I feel like when it works, it's one of the things that if you have a friend who uses an IUD and it works, I mean, she'll sing the praises from morning to night. Like when it works, because theoretically, like if you didn't have the insertion pain and if you didn't have any other side effects associated with it potentially for many would be this perfect birth control because you just set it and forget it and all of that. And so I feel like it has like this potential. But in the spirit of informed consent, it is a good idea. I think there's Facebook groups for IUDs. Those are good places to go if you want to find out the other side of it. Because like if you're hearing Teal's experience of trying to pull it out, like first of all, for it to even be coming out, you're kind of like, for anyone who hasn't heard that can happen, that your body can expel them. You might be kind of like, what? And for some women, their body literally completely expels it, just like. So that's a thing. And it does happen to a certain percentage of people who get IUDs. And then that prospect of pulling it out yourself. Yeah. And then all of that. So Teal, you're not alone. That is the point of me saying this.
Right.
And I'm sorry to hear that it was such a negative experience and you ended up in the ER and had this dismissive doctor. So that's just not great. So sorry, what I wanted to comment on related to fertility awareness is that now that I've gotten to know you a little bit, I find it fascinating. I mean, it makes sense though. I get it. I feel like I'd be curious to actually, if you wanted to expand a little bit more on your rationale for why you didn't feel that you would be responsible enough, because I get that our culture is very, very heavy on you will get pregnant if you're not on hormonal birth control, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But knowing you a little bit and having you in the program, you're highly capable and detail oriented, I would say is one of your wonderful traits. And so for me, I'm thinking, I think you would be fine, but I'm curious to actually hear what, like from where you were coming from, because you're obviously trying to be as responsible as possible. So share with us why you felt at the time that it wouldn't work for you or you wouldn't be responsible enough to do it.
Absolutely. To start, I didn't actually have all the information about fertility awareness. So I was hearing things from my friends and I don't know how, I use this word with like air quotes, but correctly they were using the method. And so I was just thinking like, I'm not quite, like, I don't know how much I trust that just hearing from them. And then I didn't actually look at the clinical research because I am a type A research human. And I think if I would have looked at the research at that time, I would have given it a more solid effort. And I'm like, oh yeah, like this is something that I can do and something that I can see is effective and that other people are doing. But at that time, I was in college. I was doing a million things. I just didn't feel like I could add another layer onto my life. And especially at that point, I absolutely knew that I did not want to get pregnant. Like 100% not an option. And so even the possibility of that being, the idea of that being a possibility pretty much took it off the table immediately.
I always respond interestingly to that comment because when you do read the information about the hormonal contraceptives, the IUD, the effectiveness is obviously very high. It's because it's not up to you. It's one of those methods where as long as you get it put in, it's the efficacy is based on the method itself, not the user. So it is one of the higher efficacies, but none of them are zero, like none of them are 100.
Absolutely. And I think at the time, I just didn't fully understand that. I think that I didn't have all the information to consider fertility awareness as like an equal, if not better option to a lot of the other forms of birth control that I've tried, like condoms or the birth control pill.
Yeah, that's interesting. That actually makes a lot of sense to me now that you've kind of talked us through that, because I feel like knowing you, you're obviously more than capable of doing it. And this is one of those interesting topics that can be a little controversial. When you talk about fertility awareness to a variety of people, parents, providers, when the question I get is like, well, what birth control do you think is appropriate for teenagers? And I always say condoms because they offer STI prevention. And let's talk about STIs. Like, why did we stop talking about that? I was a child of the 80s and 90s. Like, how did we just stop talking about STIs? Condoms. But obviously with the implication behind that question is like, you couldn't possibly be recommending fertility awareness for younger people. Obviously they're too, ridiculous to use it. And I would say case by case basis on that one, because I think that there are plenty of individuals who would be capable and willing and wanting to use it maybe alongside other methods during that fertile window, and et cetera, et cetera. So interesting. And that makes perfect sense. And yes, when you're hearing about it through the grapevine, you do get more of the like relaxed, potentially not completely informed use of fertility awareness. And that can make it seem like it wouldn't actually work, because there are plenty of people who use it or say they use it, but they've never really learned a specific method. And so they're kind of doing their own thing with it. And you might hear about unplanned pregnancies, because that obviously happens when you're not actually following the rules correctly. Right. And so that can certainly play into your, whether or not this would work, like your doubts of the methods. That makes a lot of sense. So yeah, so let us know then how that all went. So what you chose to use from there, and then kind of how you ended up meandering back to fertility awareness in the future.
Absolutely. So at that point, after I had the Serena out, I felt a little bit hopeless. I actually was very upset about the lack of options, because I knew that I was done with hormonal birth control. Like, nope, I know enough at this point where I know that's not a choice that I'm willing to make for my body again in the future. And that left me with barrier methods, which I wasn't really interested in having be a primary form of birth control. I was in a committed relationship with a past partner, and just that didn't work for where we were at. And so I felt a lot of pressure to get on the copper IUD, the Paragard, and especially some pressure from my partner. So I made the appointment, and I remember feeling hopeless, like so upset the entire day before I was going to get it in. And because my first insertion process was horrible, I actually tried to take a lot of preventative measures beforehand. So I met with a doctor before. I said I had a horrible first experience getting one in. I would like anti-anxiety medication, and I would like pain medication stronger than Tylenol, and my partner's coming with me as an advocate. I need all of these things. And luckily, this was a great provider who was like, yes, like all of those things can happen. We're going to write you some prescriptions beforehand. And even with all of that prep, it didn't feel right. And I went in, even with stronger pain medication and prescription anxiety medication, I still had a really horrible insertion process. And I just never fully wanted it, but I thought that it was the only option that was available to me at the time.
What you described with just that feeling of hopelessness, I've heard that time and time again, especially when I do groups, because when I do group programs, I'm face-to-face, usually via Zoom, but face-to-face with 6, 7, 8, sometimes like 9 or 10 women who have basically tried, like similar to your experience, where they tried the pill and then they tried this and they tried that. And so often like they're like, I'm trying to be responsible here. This didn't work for me, so I'm trying this other thing. And so, when you've already tried 3, 4, 5 different types of birth control, and you happen to be one of the people, because obviously this isn't everyone's experience. There are plenty of people for whom they try the birth control and they don't have a negative experience that works for them, or they try different things and they find something that's okay. But plenty of women end up in this scenario where they've tried all these different methods and it just doesn't, like, they can't find something that works. And to get to that point where they're literally like, what am I going to do? Now, I don't know if you want to get into this, but you mentioned a bit of pressure from your partner to use the copper IUD. Obviously, the copper IUD is one of the best non-hormonal options for someone who's looking for that kind of set it and forget it birth control method. And also you mentioned the barriers weren't really an option. And this is very common for plenty of relationships. Sex is a very personal, intimate thing. Everyone has preferences. And we talk about this a lot in the program and how to support clients with this very question. But ultimately, we have to find something that works for both parties in a situation like this. So I'm not sure if you wanted to share a little bit about that, or even just how you've approached this with clients, because this is one of the central challenges when it comes to birth control. And when you don't have a good experience with hormonal contraceptives and they're now off the table, it can feel very limiting in terms of what is actually left.
Absolutely. I think that when in my experience and working with clients who have partners or other people in their life that are a little on the fence or have feelings about them using fertility awareness rather than a more traditional form of birth control, I think that it comes down to the partner not fully understanding or holding space for why they're making that choice. Fertility awareness is amazing, but also learning it is work. And it does take effort from both parties in a relationship, primarily the person that is actually charting their cycles. But I'm trying to think about where I was going with this now. I think just that when there's hesitation from partners, I think that they don't really understand that, like, oh, this is a last choice for a lot of people once they find out it's there, because hormonal birth control has negatively affected so many people. I don't know if I'm actually going anywhere with this thought right now.
Well, what you're saying makes perfect sense, because it's fertility awareness, like you said, it is work. Yeah. And it is a last resort choice. And it's also the off the beaten path type of option that many people haven't heard of before. So that can be a challenge in and of itself, presenting it to your partner, especially when you're both zero on that scale of intention, where you really don't want to have a pregnancy. And both of you are very responsible people. I've had plenty of clients whose partners are not comfortable not using the condom anymore, or very, and again, I think it goes back to your own experience with fertility awareness, where you didn't have a lot of information about it. And so you really just, what you've heard on the grapevine is that it doesn't work. What did they call people who use the rhythm method? Parents. So that's really like your experience of it. And so that makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, back to your experience. So you're, and again, like, this is why we have to have these conversations. Like, you actually did amazing to advocate for yourself in that situation, right? Like asking for the medication, asking for your partner to be supportive. I mean, I feel like plenty of women might have heard that and thought, wow, like you could do that. And it still wasn't that great. So then what happened after that? So you had it inserted. What was your experience like with the copper IUD?
It had its ups and downs. It was an effective birth control method for me. My periods got heavier and more painful. I also have struggled on and off with anemia from the time that I was a teen. And so I always felt a little bit concerned about the amount of blood that I was losing, since I tended to have low iron levels. But overall, like, on paper, it was fine, but I always knew that it was there. And like, I feel like sometimes physically I could feel it, but sometimes even just energetically, I just felt that there was a foreign object in my body. And so I felt like it was the best option available to me, but it was always kind of in the back of my head. Like, I wish this wasn't the easiest option that I knew about that was available.
And how long did you end up using it for? And like, how did that all play out?
Absolutely. So that leads into my transition to fertility awareness. So I had the Paragard for 5 years, and for 2 years, during the last 2 years that I had it in, I found out that I had cervical dysplasia. And this was when I was in herb school. And so I was doing a lot of the deep dives into the research. And at first started really small interventions that felt like, oh, it'll probably go away on its own. So I'm just going to eat some more brassicas and drink my green tea, which I think were great and supportive for the immune system. But over time, as that dysplasia wasn't clearing, I started doing more research into like thinking about, okay, like what is actually happening with my cervix? Like I have these slightly abnormal cells, and I also have this IUD. Like there's a foreign object in there. That's creating an inflammatory environment. How do I expect these slight abnormalities to clear when there's an inflammatory environment? So that was really the catalyst for me to get the IUD out and to start doing serious research and learning fertility awareness.
Jumping into today's episode with some exciting news to share. The Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship Program, Class of 2023, starts in January. If you've been searching for a practical way to incorporate fertility awareness cycle charting into your existing women's health practice, then this is the program for you. The Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship is a 9-month program that provides the necessary training to incorporate fertility awareness cycle charting into your existing practice. This program cuts out all the fluff by combining the science with the practical application of charting and allows you to support your clients by monitoring their 5th vital sign in a standardized way. Finally, a program that teaches you to use the menstrual cycle as a diagnostic tool with your clients. Transform your practice in 9 months. Apply now at fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMlive. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. Yeah, that's interesting that was the impetus for you. And you had the IUD in for 5 years, you mentioned. And you mentioned that you had a bit heavier periods and I think a bit more cramping during that time, which is pretty typical of the side effect profile. You can hear my baby here in the background sucking away. She's kind of a loud eater. But yeah, so that's really interesting. So then at the time that you transition to fertility, it's your story's so interesting, Teal, because it's like you literally tried like everything
Right.
on your journey to kind of make this all work. And this is something also I feel really strongly about. This is a serious burden, I would say, on women to have to sort this out. Because with men, and I'm getting all, gender specific here, but with men, it's condoms or pull out. That's what's available for men, or a vasectomy. That's what's available. Right. And that's it, And then with women, we have all these options, but it feels like in a way there's all these options, but essentially half of them are iterations on the same thing, which are iterations on hormonal methods. So there's not a lot of choices, and it can be very stressful when the choices available don't work for you personally. In terms of switching over to FAMM, maybe you could just share what that was like in general and like what mental hoops you had to go through to be okay with using it, but also how your partner at the time responded. Like what was that like? Because I know that's a big concern also, going from having the way I talk about it, of course, is I talk about having contraceptive methods as making your body resistant to sperm, quote unquote. And so when you use fertility awareness, you've now pulled the goalie. And so now your body's not resistant to sperm. So then you have to kind of have this whole other negotiation process with your partner. So how did that all go?
Right. It went really well. So I had when my current partner, when we started dating, I had the copper IUD in, and it was convenient. But I think even when we started dating years ago, I was vocal about, I have this thing, I don't love it. And then when I started testing positive for the cervical dysplasia and working on that and waiting, and it wasn't clearing, he definitely knew that I was getting more and more anxious about that. I'm like, I feel like my immune system should be clearing this. Why isn't that happening? Like I am eating all the foods and taking the supplements and doing the herbs. Like there's some mechanism in my body that is keeping this here. Like what is that? And once I started thinking about could it be the IUD? He was incredibly supportive. And, then you need to get that out. And what's the next step? So for me, being the type of person that I am, I set up a timeline and said, okay, I want to get my IUD out in 3 months. So I'm going to give myself 3 months to learn fertility awareness while I still have it in as a safeguard. So I went down to the local bookstore and picked up a copy of Taking Charge of Your Fertility and read it cover to cover a couple of times and downloaded the Read Your Body app, did research on just like, the tools that I wanted to use to make that transition. And for me, it was really intuitive to pick up once after the first couple weeks. I was surprised by how much it all made sense and clicked. I think it really helped that I was in herb school at this time, so I already knew so much more about anatomy and physiology and about hormone cycles and systems than I did when I first heard about fertility awareness. So it all was able to line up in a way that made it feel pretty easy to pick up. And it was also kind of a process of letting go in some ways. As a more like type A, like woody person, it's kind of that like trusting yourself. It was a process of learning how to trust myself and trust my body and to realize that I have the capacity to be in charge of my fertility and to communicate with my partner in a way where we're both on the same page about what needs to happen when during the cycle.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like the way that you approached it, I mean, it's in line with everything that you've talked about so far. You're obviously doing everything possible to be responsible, to do things the right way so that you have the outcome that you want, which obviously in your case is to have effective birth control. And also the response for your partner now, everyone's experience is different, in terms of how open your partner is to this. But what I always say is when you're in a relationship with someone who cares about you, they want you to be happy, but also not sick. And so when you have this negative experience, in your case, the IUD contributing to inflammation, you felt that it was prolonging, like, or inhibiting your body's ability to clear it, basically, from the sounds of it. In those situations, or for, in other situations with other women that I've interviewed, it's like they're having really bad depression or anxiety or low libido or whatever.
Right.
And as soon as your partner can make that connection that, oh, I'm using this birth control that's causing these problems, often the response is like, yeah, you got to get off of that, because they want you to be happy and healthy. And that would be what we would hope for in a loving relationship. So just to kind of put that out there. And I love that you took that 3 months, which is recommended to learn. And based on how you've described your experience with cycling and with your body and how your level of intuitiveness with your, with what's going on in your body and all of that, it does make sense that and this is just general for most women who learn to chart their cycles, assuming that they're cycling, fairly consistently. Obviously the process takes longer if your cycles are super long or something like that. But when you've gone through 2 to 3 cycles of like a full cycle of charting, a lot of what you need to know becomes apparent. And it's not, although it does take work, it's not something that takes like years to understand.
No, not at all. And I think also things just lined up for me really well, where I feel like when I made the choice to start using fertility awareness, I was just in the right place for it in a number of ways, where I could really start doing it and start seeing things make sense, and then just start doing such a deep dive. I think I had the typical response that a lot of folks that menstruate do when they find out about it, where there's some anger about like, why didn't I know about this earlier? Why isn't this common knowledge, even for someone that had studied health in some capacities for years and grew up with midwives and doulas in my community? Like, how did I not know this? So I kind of went through those stages and then instantly was like, this is it. Like, this is the stuff. I love it. And I want to tell everyone about it. And then my gears started turning about like, okay, this is amazing. How can I end up integrating this with the clinical herbalism work that I'm doing? Because I feel like there's so many connections between the two, and they were both the things that I found that, outside of class time, I was getting extra books on and digging into PubMed and doing the clinical research. I feel like when in your spare time, you're like spending all your time looking into something, it's a good sign that you should probably try to pursue it a little more.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this is a great way to kind of transition from your personal story into how you decided to jump into the FAMM program. And integrate, make that decision to integrate this into your professional practice. So maybe take a moment to describe also, just to tell us a little bit about what you do. Usually I ask this at the very beginning, but we ended up jumping into your personal story, which was, I think, really important actually. And I feel like this episode is going to be really helpful. But yeah, a great opportunity to share a little bit about your background and what you do, but also, yeah, like maybe share a little bit about what your experience has been like in the program so far, working with practicum clients and kind of bringing together the world of herbalism and fertility awareness.
Absolutely. I have a few thoughts on this. So, as I've talked about so far today, I've had some pretty negative experiences with getting medical care, and especially with getting medical care connected to my reproductive system. And I think that all of those experiences really led me down the path towards pursuing herbalism. I have training as a clinical herbalist, and so with herbalism, it's a wide net of what that can mean. Lots of folks work with plants in different capacities. So clinical herbalism is more focused on, I guess I'm going to start that in a different way. Herbalism is amazing because you can make tinctures and salves for your family and friends. And like, that means you're an herbalist, and that's amazing. You can make tea blends and sell them at the farmer's market. That means you're an herbalist. Beautiful. And then also there are people that have more chronic conditions. There are people that have endocrine disorders and people that take a lot of medications. And if you're a person like that, or just a person that wants a more clinical type of herbal care, I think it's important to work with someone that has a clinical herbal training and that can take multiple conditions into account and knows about herb-drug interactions, and also like knows the science behind, okay, these are the constituents in these plants that act on these tissues in the body to promote balance and normal functioning. And so when I was initially having these negative experiences in the traditional healthcare field, and also knew that I loved plants and wanted to work with them, I knew that I wanted to make a positive change, or be a positive resource for people in a clinical setting. And so that's kind of a long-winded way of explaining why I pursued clinical herbalism specifically. And then as I was doing my clinical herbalist education, this is kind of during the same time that I was dealing with the cervical dysplasia, that I was getting my IUD out and starting to do a deep dive into fertility awareness. And while I was doing all this research, I just kind of fell in love with the reproductive system and the endocrine system, and thinking about all the hormones and how they cycle and how it affects everything else in our body. And so when I went into doing the supervised clinical internship portion of my training program, I ended up specializing in reproductive care and reproductive endocrinology, really. And I'm trying to think about where else I wanted to go with that. But that's kind of how I ended up in the sphere of hormonal health and reproductive health, primarily for folks that menstruate and folks that have uteruses, folks assigned female at birth. So that's kind of how I got there. I don't know if I answered everything in your question. Oh, you were also curious about how the program has been going. So for me, learning fertility awareness was really easy for me because I was really motivated, and I think things just lined up in that way. But talking to other people in my community, I realized that a lot of other folks don't have as easy of a time with it. Like just picking up a book and reading it isn't enough for them. Or they would pick up that book and read it and be like, okay, but my cycles don't look like this. Like, how am I supposed to learn this system when I don't have the textbook cycles, which, don't really exist? So that is one of the things that really motivated me to pursue looking into the FAMM course. I realized that I really wanted to teach fertility awareness, or to be a resource for people to learn about charting their cycles, and use that as an assessment tool to learn more about overall health. And I started looking into more the 2-year fertility awareness educator training. So this was right when I was finishing up 3 years plus of my clinical herbalist education. I was like, no way. Like, I'm not going back to school for 2 more years. And some of it's a lot of the basics, I mean, not basics, but the important foundations that I already just learned, like deep dives into anatomy and physiology, deep dives into hormonal endocrine health. And so I was like, okay, I know I want to do this thing, but also it doesn't feel appropriate for me to start a whole other long program when I already have a lot of the experience that you would be learning in that program, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. And that was one of the key kind of parts of this program when I was designing it and determining what it was going to be. I wanted to fill that hole the best that I could, because that's basically what it is when you already are a busy practitioner, or like you said, when you've already completed your several-year practitioner program in your chosen field, to go into a program where you're basically being taken from beginning to end again can feel just not the right fit. Especially, like, I know people are busy, I'm busy. So if you're wanting to learn something, and I suppose the other thing that I aimed to do with the program is I aimed to make it very practical, so that obviously we still have to go over the reproductive anatomy. We still have to do that for the purpose of this program. But I aim to cut out things that are not practical to the best of my ability, so that you're diving right in, but when you jump into the program, we're just running right into what you need to know when you're working with clients. So you can let me know what your experience, was. Obviously there is work. And I would say the biggest kind of complaint, in a nice way, that I hear about is that there is homework, like there are assignments, like there are things, there is work in the program. But again, I aim to make it so that it's all relevant to your client experience. You can share a little bit about what that's been like, because you are a busy practitioner with a thriving practice, and you have a lot on your plate and a lot going on. And also adding this to that for this 9-month period, but it's essentially the 2022 year that we're in here, that this program is going, what that's been like, but also what it has, because you've been working with clients, you're in deep into your practicum at this stage, what it's been like to incorporate the charting aspect to what you were doing already.
Right, absolutely. Great question. So for me, I actually just finished my herbal training program in December of this past year, and then ended up starting the FAMM program in January, like pretty much right afterwards, which felt a little insane at the time, but actually ended up working so well, because I was still in that school mindset. I still had like, okay, yeah, I work and then I stay up and do my extra stuff after that. So kind of that transition ended up working really well, because this program takes a lot less time than the full-time training program that I was in. So even just transitioning to having a few homework assignments spread out over a number of weeks felt very manageable. And honestly, especially with a program that's taking place over Zoom, I love having some accountability with assignments, because it's just another way to stay engaged. Like, I feel like Zoom is such a tricky beast, because it's easy to check out at some point when you're not like actively together in community with people, even though I think you can create space in Zoom settings and make connections. But having that extra little piece of accountability was really helpful for me, and something that I appreciated. And I mean, it honestly ended up working out perfectly, kind of rolling from my last training program into this, because I knew that eventually I wanted to learn how to work with fertility awareness professionally in some capacity. And then I was finishing up school and thinking about launching my practice. I was like, okay, do I launch my full practice now and then learn more about facilitating fertility awareness down the road, and then have to change all my intake forms and kind of restructure my whole practice? Or do I sign up for this amazing training now and do a soft launch on my herbal stuff? I'm seeing some clients part-time, but really finishing up all my education, having that be done, and then launching kind of my official practice, incorporating all of that information, having all of those systems in place. And that's the choice that I decided to do. And I feel so thankful that I did that, because I think that taking this program has made me a better practitioner in a lot of ways, because I already knew, like, I know herbal protocols and some nutritional protocols for PCOS, endo, dysmenorrhea, coming from a very specific herbal background. And now learning the FAMM program protocols for those same presenting situations, I can take the parts that I love about both of those and combine them. So it's been a really amazing opportunity to learn a different way of looking at conditions that I was already really familiar with, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It does. It sounds like a nice compliment. And I know we've kind of had we haven't obviously went down the herbal route fully, but even in class, we've had conversations where obviously your herbal knowledge supplements, obviously, everything, and works really well together. So a couple of questions that I have just to throw out there, because these are questions that I think every practitioner has to deal with, whether they're in the program right now or whether they're thinking about joining it later on. But one of the challenges I think for many practitioners is incorporating both, like their professional designation plus the fertility awareness, because
right.
I think my bias is that I do think that many people underestimate fertility work, because it's its own thing. It's its own wheelhouse, and you could have a practice doing it by itself. So then when you're incorporating that with your existing professional designation, I know, pretty much all of the practitioners have to figure out how they're going to do that. Am I going to do combined sessions? Am I going to do alternate sessions, or what am I going to do? Because I have to teach them all this information with my professional designation, but I also would like to take them through the FAMM process. So not that you necessarily would have all of those answers now, but maybe you could just share a little bit about how that's been for you, kind of as you are planning to, as you mentioned, design your practice with both of these aspects, and you've had to kind of think through all of that. What has your experience been with trying to balance your professional designation and fertility awareness?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's when there's not a roadmap, like I'm sure there are folks that are doing herbal work with fertility awareness. I don't know any of them. So it's kind of just like walking into the woods, like, okay, let's put this together. I don't know where it's going. The part that I feel really sure about, and the part that seemed really exciting to me from the beginning, is the ability to use the chart as an assessment tool to get specific about when to use certain herbs. So being able to say, this is a pretty classic example, like you've been charting for a few months and there are signs of low progesterone on the chart, and an herb that lots of folks are familiar with is Vitex. And so then you can literally say, like, hey, we can use this as an assessment tool. We can see that these signs point towards low progesterone. Let's give you this specific herb that helps raise progesterone. So just being able to, I feel like with herbalism, if folks don't know about herbs, sometimes it can be a little like, okay, yeah, I'm trying this thing that's doing this vague thing. But if you're using the chart, it's kind of another way to back up what you're explaining to them about using the plant. Like, this is the specific use and what it's doing in the body. And here we can actually track and see what happens. Like, let's say you take the tincture for 3 months and all of a sudden your signs of low progesterone are improving. Like, I think that it can be really empowering for clients to be able to see that change happening and to be able to really feel solid about the choices that they're making, about the herbs or supplements that they're taking. Like, oh, I'm doing this because of these observations that I can see in my cycle. And then if it's working, I'll be able to see that over time. Mm-hmm. So that feels really exciting. The part that I'm still working out a little bit is figuring out integrating the FAMM teaching process with the intake process, because they both take a good amount of time. And I think it might be the sort of thing that you maybe like I'll have to try a couple different things and see what works and get feedback from clients. Yeah, so that's something that I'm still kind of planning out and feeling excited about, but don't really have a concrete plan yet.
Mm-hmm. I know, and in class, there's a lot of different approaches. Some practitioners are planning to kind of offer, maybe like a group night where they'll do an intro session for a bunch of clients at one time, and then they can kind of incorporate it into their follow-up sessions. And so there's a lot of different creative ways to bring it together in a practical sense. But one of the questions that I think I've asked a couple times in the series, because even if you are not able to, or if all of your clients don't necessarily want to go down the whole detailed fertility awareness charting role, I would imagine that still having this knowledge and even having a general sense of what's happening in someone's cycle and how it relates to health would still be helpful, because I don't know. After going through this program, I'm guessing you can't shut off the fertility awareness knowledge or the cycle knowledge. So, but I mean, for anyone who's thinking about jumping into the FAMM program as a professional, as a women's health professional, what, if anything, would you want them to know about just that choice? If someone's thinking, is this going to benefit my practice? How am I going to make it all work? What would you want them to know?
Yeah, absolutely. I would want them to know that, I mean, I can only speak from personal experience and to say that even as someone who's been studying reproductive health for a number of years and grew up around people that had a lot of knowledge about reproductive health and hormonal health and fertility, I still learned so many things in this program that I didn't know before. And that's like, as someone that's been semi-immersed in this world and in these communities. So I think that then you think about the people that are walking around that haven't grown up with those resources or haven't taken the initiative to do research into all of it. And I think that there's just so much to learn and so much that people still don't know about how bodies and hormones work, and think that it's really great to have information, and it's really appreciated hearing just a different, not exactly what I wanted to say. It's been worthwhile to have this information. I've learned a lot, and I think that other practitioners, even if they already think that they know a lot about hormonal health and reproductive health, will still learn new things in this program, which is great.
Oh, awesome, Teal. That's really great to hear. I mean, it's so interesting. I could pick your brain for the rest of the afternoon on your herbal training, because as I've said many times in class, I do not have an herbal training background. But what I find interesting about putting all of these pieces together of health is that from each practitioner's professional training, we all have a certain perspective. And it's really interesting to be able to put those different hats on and to look at the same situation from these different lenses. And so being able to jump into the fertility awareness lens and looking at the menstrual cycle as a vital sign is, for me, I'm biased because that's my primary tool, but I find it to be invaluable. And I find that it really kind of changes how you look at the body when you look at it all together. So I'm thrilled that you've been able to incorporate this into your herbalism practice. And I'm curious, in the future to kind of follow up with all of my practitioners to find out how you've amalgamated it all together. So as we wrap up today, I would love for you to take a moment to share a little bit about you, where you are in the world, and how people can get in touch with you if you're on the socials and all the places.
Absolutely. One other thing I'll say quickly, just that's been great about the FAMM program, is being able to meet with practitioners from a variety of modalities and hearing about their experiences. That has been a really great thing, hearing from everyone's little particular lens, what they know and how they would approach a situation. But I am in central northern-ish Vermont in the US, and I am on at least one of the socials. You can find me on Instagram at Teal, and I think that's about it for where folks can find me right now, and where I plan on having some materials and offerings up.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure to link that in the show notes page, and yeah, anything that you want to put out there even later on, you can let me know, and I'll just attach it to the show notes page so that you can learn more about Teal. And I just want to thank you so much for being on the show today. Although we have been together for about 9 months now, I feel like this conversation allowed me to have a much greater window and insight into just your history with birth control. I learned a lot about your story just from this call. And I think that's one of the reasons why I love doing these calls, because in our class time, we don't necessarily have the opportunity to kind of flesh it all out. So I really appreciate you for sharing your experience. And I feel like it's such a valuable, I don't know, I just really feel like when we hear the experiences, the real life experiences of women with birth control and the different challenges, I feel like it's so valuable and helpful. Because you won't know, Teal, how many women tuned into this episode, had similar experiences and felt supported and encouraged just from hearing how you went through it. So thank you so much for sharing all of that.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Lisa.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/440. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode with Teal. It was just such a great opportunity to have this conversation with her. I feel like so many important points came out in today's episode. It really highlights some of the challenges that so many of us face when we're looking for effective, reliable birth control with minimal side effects. And it's a great episode to highlight where fertility awareness really comes into all of this, because fertility awareness is really one of the very few methods that have absolutely no side effects, because it's not a method that alters your body in any way or exposes you to anything, any hormones. It's a method where we learn to read and understand our bodies and respond accordingly. And so in that way, fertility awareness is very unique because it doesn't change our bodies. We're just learning to work alongside our bodies. And it's also an entirely user-dependent method because it really relies on your ability to understand what's going on and respond accordingly. And so Teal's experience is really interesting because it highlights that personal experience with it, discovering how powerful and useful and helpful it is for birth control, but then also deepening into the aspect of utilizing the menstrual cycle as a vital sign. And so as many of my practitioners in the FAMM program will attest, on the show and their episodes, having that personal experience of how transformative switching over to fertility awareness charting can be really informs their decision to then utilize it as a vital sign in their practice. I feel like it's it's part of my story as well. Once you've experienced how transformative it can be to shift to this way of doing things, looking at the cycle, shift away from hormonal contraceptives, and actually discovering that the method is effective when used correctly, can be really powerful to implement also with your clients. So I just want to thank Teal for coming on the show and sharing her experience. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting.